Good morning, y'all. It's early this morning. It's a little bit after 5, about 5 minutes after 5, according to my watch. I'm sitting out here in the backyard where me and my darling live, along with our daughter Morgan and our twin grandbabies we call Bubba and Sissy. They're 3.5 years old, and I'll tell you, they love their papa, but they can wear him out. I thought I'd come out here before dawn again and talk to you a little bit, tell you a story or two, and talk about some of the history from the mountains this morning before dawn. A week ago, as you all probably know, there was a great flood, historical flood, down in eastern Kentucky, and in my county where I grew up, where my family's lived since the early 1800s, down in Clay County, Kentucky. Other counties surrounding that area were just as affected. Towns like Hindman and Neon and other little towns just were devastated. But I want to talk to you this morning about a little town that's near and dear to my heart called Oneida. You see, Oneida is where I went to high school. I graduated from Oneida Baptist Institute, a settlement school there in Oneida. It's up on a little hill, a little mountain, if you will, called Mount Moriah. That's what our founder of Oneida Baptist Institute named that little hill that they built the high school on. It wasn't just a high school back then. I have my cup of coffee. It's hot. I doctor it. I put a little sugar, a little creamer in it. I'm not gonna lie to you, I couldn't drink black coffee if you paid me $100. Maybe for 1,000 I'd drink a cup, but boy, you'd have to talk to me. Well, maybe for $100 for the right cause, I wouldn't. Later this morning, I'm going to be selling honey off the front porch of my little old house here in Beaver Creek, Ohio. I've got a tobacco stick here. We called them backer sticks when I was little, and it was used when tobacco was harvested. They would put the tobacco stalks on a stick like this, and then they'd hang them up in a barn to let the tobacco dry, and then they would be able to take those stalks off, pull the leaves off, grade them according to the color and the quality of the tobacco, and then take it to market later on and sell it. I've got if you see the glow kind of changing a little bit, I've got my big old bug candle, because early in the morning the mosquitoes love me. I must be delicious, apparently. But here's what I want to talk to you about. Prior to the turn of the century, from the late 1800s into the 1900s, there were blood feuds going on in eastern Kentucky, and especially in Clay County. The Baker-Howard feud was going on, and it was bad. There were others. The Eversoles were involved, the Whites were involved, and others apparently. Further on down by the Tug River, you know about the Hatfield and the McCoy feud. That apparently started over a pig. I'm told, in reading and listening, I'm told that a lot of the feuding in Clay County started over two families and relationships between boys and girls. Don't know the details. It sounds a whole lot like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet from the things that I heard, but the feud and the blood feuds got bad. Now, James Anderson Burns, who founded the little school that I went to, he was living in West Virginia with his mama and his daddy. His daddy was a circuit riding preacher, and he heard about the feuds, and he heard about family honor, and he decided when he was about 16 years old, he had some of an education, but he decided to go back and help defend the family honor. And that's exactly what he told his daddy, his mama, that he was going to do. He was going back and he was going to defend the family honor by becoming a feudalist, a member of that feuding community that was there in Clay County. His daddy asked him to make a promise, and he asked his son to promise that he would wait a year. He would get more education. He would wait a year, and then a year later, if he chose, he could go back and join the feuding, the blood feuds in Clay County. Not too long after that, somebody came and told his mama and him and his siblings that his daddy, a circuit riding preacher who walked from place to place, church to preach. Because here's the thing, sometimes them little old churches, they didn't have a regular preacher, and they had a fellow that might come once a month, might come every couple, 3 or 4 months if he had a lot of a circuit to cover. He was a Baptist preacher, and somebody came and said that James Anderson Burns' daddy was found dead. He had been walking from church to church, and he died in his circuit, in his journey, in his ministry. And James Anderson Burns was true to the promise that he made his daddy, and he waited a year. But after a year, he went back with his family, with his mama and others, to the old Burns homestead up on Bullskin. If you've listened to any of the news about Clay County, you know that Bullskin, Crane Creek, and other creeks were hugely affected by the flooding. And that's what brought all this to mind. He was involved in the feuds. At one point, within a couple years after his 16th birthday, him and a bunch of other boys, all related to the Burns family, decided to go over to Newfound, a little community there in Clay County. And they went to converge on and attack a cabin over there in Newfound. The fighting got bad. Burns was hurt, threw over a hillside, and left for dead. He woke up laying there in the weeds a couple days later. And during that time, God spoke to him, he tells. He climbed up out of that hillside, out of the weeds, and up on the top of the mountain where he was, close to Newfound, he spent the next several days praying. Now, from all I've read and from my guess, he didn't have a bite of food. I suspect he might have had water, but I suspect he was on a self-imposed fast during that time, and he prayed and he asked God what his place was in life. And he realized that there was a great need in the mountains of Appalachia, a great need in Clay County, a great need in the hills and hollers down yonder to educate children, because it might be too late for the adults, but perhaps they could bring education to that part of the country and teach them, give them book learning, as it was called. Well, he went back and he went to Denison University for a while, Denison College, and got some more education. And then he went back and he went to the little community of Oneida. Now, Oneida, there are 3 rivers, little bitty rivers actually. In some places you can walk across all 3 of them when the water's low. The Bullskin, the Redbird, and now what is the third one? Bullskin and Redbird, and I don't remember what the third one is offhand right now. I'll think of it. But there were 3 families living at that time in Oneida. And he went there and he decided there was a place that God had called him to. Now, I'm going to post in the comments, I'm going to post a poem after a while that Barclay Moore, the president in the 1970s into the 1980s of Oneida, that he would quote. And I love the poem. It's an old poem, and the poet asks God where he should serve, and God points to a little place and says, "That's where I want you to serve." And the poet, the servant, says, "But God, that is such a little place. Why don't you give me something more than that? It's just a little place." And God reminds the poet, the servant, that Nazareth was a little place, and so was Galilee. That's how it ends, and I love that. That's where Barclay Moore served, but that's where God called James Anderson Burns to serve. He went there, and he started talking with some other folks, telling them, his calling, his dream. He met with a man who saw that vision with him, and they sat down, and they decided that there was only one way to end the feuds. Now, here's the interesting thing. You may have heard of the feud leaders, and you may have heard names. And the thing I will tell you is the feud leaders were not the ones who were in charge of running in and getting guns and shooting up the place. The feud leaders were the ones who did their best to keep their side quiet and peaceful and keep the guns put away. So James Anderson Burns and his friends sat down together, and they started making a list of names of men that would be trustees for a school up there on that hillside. The only thing on the hillside, there were only 3 families living in Oneida. The only thing on the hillside was a log barn, a log stable, if you will, down in the community, down where those three rivers, the confluence of those 3 rivers became the South Fork of the Kentucky River. They looked down, and there was a little store down there, post office in the store for people to get mail if it came. And they chose there. And they wrote down the names of men, and they came up with 12 men that could serve. And they called the community together from all around, and a whole passel of folks came. And James Anderson Burns and his friends shared the vision and shared the fact that perhaps the only salvation for their children and their grandchildren was to educate them, because with education would come peace. They named 12 men. 12 men decided to serve. Only half of them could even read and write their names. The others had to make an X. And those men together chose to serve to help build a little school, a settlement school, in 1899. I believe it was the first. Some other schools claim to be the first, but in 1899, James Anderson Burns chose to start a little settlement school where a community would grow around it, and they would educate, they would teach, they would grow the knowledge and the wisdom of those around. He took 2 crowbars, took them to a local blacksmith, and had them cut into stone chisels. And he went and he found local stone up there on the hillside, Mount Moriah. And he began with the stone chisels and a wooden mallet to chisel out the stones that became the foundation of the first school that was being built up there. Soon others heard the story, and they came, and soon there were 20 men, and they were building. And they got the schoolhouse mostly done, but it didn't have an inside. It didn't have everything it needed. They were almost done. And then a man named Hensley showed up one day. He had a sled. Now, when I say sled, don't think of one with wooden runners. It would have, with metal runners, it would have wooden runners, and it would be a flat platform. And on that sled was a stack of well-aged and even smoky-looking cut planks. And James Anderson Burns asked that Hensley man, well, where did this come from? And he learned that man took the inside out of his home. That loft up there, he took down, and he brought those planks so that Burns could finish the school. And Burns did, and soon hundreds of families came applying to go there, and they had no place. I remember reading a story of a man coming from some distance with his 2 daughters on his mule, asking if they could go to school, and Burns had to turn them away because there was no place for those children to stay in that little community. Three families is all. And then he realized the need for dormitories. And they started building crude plank dormitories for boys and girls to stay in. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. He went around and he talked to churches and tried to get them to help, and many of them did help, and folks came from up east and from the north to help teach eventually. At one point, they were so desperate for food, they decided to go fishing, and the waters was up. It flooded a lot there. Those three rivers that joined together would flood that little community. I remember when I was going to school there, more than once I saw the floodwaters. And as they were down looking to consider fishing, they realized that the waters were too high to fish. There was too much mud. It was too muddy to fish. And then they saw something floating along, and they had a stick and they pulled it in, and it was a fish trap, a big fish trap, and it was full of big fat catfish, and they were able to feed the students there. They considered that to be a miracle. Eventually, Burns started going all over the country. He was called Burns of the Mountains, and he would tell the story of Oneida, his little settlement school. And he was part of the Chautauqua circuit, the Chautauqua movement. He went all over the country and he told people the story, and folks from all over sent money down to that little school to educate the mountain children. It's a great story. My great Aunt Sally, aunt by marriage, she was a brewer. Her daddy went to school there, and I remember sitting on the front porch with my cousin J.M. and listening to a story. He said, should have listened more, but my cousin J.M.'s papa, his grandpa, went to school over to Oneida when Burns was still teaching. Now, Burns died in 1945. On a hot day, those youngins, they'd get to where they was tired and hot and weren't paying no attention. And Burns would stand up and he'd walk around behind the students and he'd slap them on the back. 3 or 4 or 5 of them, part of them, maybe all of them, I don't know. And he'd say, catch me if you can. And he went out the door of that school and commenced to running through the mountains with them boys and girls chasing him, laughing just as hard as they could laugh, and running through the mountains from place to place, playing the biggest game of mountain hide and seek you can imagine. And I remember my cousin J.M.'s papa telling that story. Catch me if you can. Catch me if you can. Now, I started to school there in 1967. I graduated as Mr. Oneida in 1971. That and $5, I can buy coffee at any Starbucks in America. It may not be good coffee, but I can buy coffee at any Starbucks in America with that title. Well, Oneida's still around. I have cousins before me and after me and family members that went to Oneida. Oneida changed my life. I was called by my Lord to serve him while I was at Oneida. Just recently, my 2 best friends from high school, Bob Clark and Tim Searcy, and I got together. Dr. Tim Searcy, I should say, retired from full-time ministry. Well, I know him well enough to know he's not done. He's a couple years younger than Bob and I. Bob's just a little bit older than me. He has a birthday coming up this fall, and I have a big birthday coming up in the spring in March. You'll hear more about that later. But we got together because when we were in high school, we would go around all those little communities and we'd sing. We sang Southern gospel songs, the 3 of us. I sang bass, and my roommate, my dearest friend in the world, Bob Clark, would sing lead, and then Tim Searcy had this beautiful tenor voice. Now we've all aged, and all our voices have changed, and Dr. Tim Searcy is not singing the high tenor that he used to sing. But we got together back in the early spring, and we sang together one more time. And it was just an amazing thing. And Bob and I traveled through the hills of eastern Kentucky. We went to see where Loretta Lynn was born, up there on Butcher Holler. And we spent time together, and we talked about our experience, talked about the changes that that little old school, that settlement school that was founded in 1899 made in our lives. And it did. I am who I am today. I am who I am because of Oneida, that little town. Now, a week ago, yesterday I guess it was, in 24 hours they had 8 inches of rain. In 4 days they had over 12 inches of rain. And they had a historic flood. A couple people lost their lives in Clay County. Dozens and dozens and dozens of families in Oneida, where I went to high school, lost everything. Preacher friends of mine that I grew up with, are there doing all they can. Bullskin, where the Burns homestead was, where James Anderson Burns went back to be a part of the feuds. It had unprecedented flooding. Crane Creek, Mr. Jerry Smith, one of the teachers at Oneida, used to take me and Bob and Tim up to his church that he preached at upon Crane Creek, and we'd sing, and we got to preach some. And I loved Mr. Jerry Smith. He was one of the finest Christian men I've ever known in my life, one of the smartest men I've ever known in my life. And he could look at you, he'd raise one eyebrow, and he'd turn his head and just look at you. And I believe he could see right down through my soul. That's what I believe. Crane Creek had flooding. And it's devastating. It's devastating. Now, remember I told you a buddy of mine who's a reenactor, Paul, he's coming after a while. He's going to buy some honey. I'm going to be selling honey in my front yard on my porch. And I've got 10 of these tobacco sticks that I'm going to be selling to. Not selling, asking for donations. They're old and beat up. They've been out in the weather. They've been rained on. They've been hailed on. They've experienced, some of them 75 and 100 years of life since they were cut down, since they were split. And these are all split. They aren't cut, they're split. And they're from Oneida. A buddy of mine, Buzz Sharp, a high school buddy, let me come over and go through his barn and pick out some really fine-looking tobacco sticks. Now, fine-looking and tobacco sticks, that's kind of an oxymoron. But I'm going to have 10 of them out for folks and ask them to give a donation to flood relief specifically for Oneida. And then I'm going to send it to a preacher friend of mine down there who's working in Oneida and helping folks out, and ask him to distribute it to different folks that need it. But this morning, in the early dawn hours, it's not here yet, as I talk about the history of Oneida, it's a growing community that's devastated. In 1899, James Anderson Burns understood that education, knowledge, brought peace. 120 some years ago, when the school got started, there were factions that wouldn't speak to each other. And you know what the amazing thing is today? The amazing thing today is the descendants, the heirs of that education are coming together. Even now, they're up. They're getting ready. They're putting on their gumboots and their oldest breeches and shirts, and they're getting their shovels and their equipment, getting on four-wheelers and even horses. And they're going out into those hollers to find folks that have needs to help. People from all over the country are sending money and sending food and water and goods, medicine. Heinemann and Whitesburg and some of those areas. There's a hospital down there, little old hospital clinic that lost everything. And the doctor was on Facebook begging for people to provide whatever they could. Apple Shop, which was started back in the 60s and 70s, and some people call it the Smithsonian of the South of the mountains. It was devastated. So much was lost. Don't know if it'll ever be regained. They had 2 films that they had just completed that were completely lost because of the flooding. A preacher friend of mine, Bobby Stevens, down there, he did a video, and he was talking about going out, and they were in a side-by-side, a 4-wheeler little old thing, and they came upon a house that had been swept over 50 feet, 60 feet maybe, off of its foundations. And sitting under a tree not too far from that house was a man. Bobby said he appeared to be late 30s, maybe 40. And he was sitting there, and I cannot imagine the horror he felt as he sat and he looked at his home. And his partner came out, a woman that had been through the floods with him. I don't know if she was his wife, his girlfriend. I don't know, but they had been asleep when the waters came up through the floor. 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And it came up so fast that was all they could do to get out a window and up a hillside. Now, I'm sitting here, I have this little thing. This is kind of neat. And you can see I'm holding it up. It's a neat little thing. It's solar, and it's a blow-up thing. It has a little LED light on the inside. I can plug my cell phone in when it's fully charged, and I like it because I can let the air out of it, and it stores flat. But they didn't have anything like that. They didn't have a flashlight, from what I understand. And they went up the hillside by that home, by that house that was swept down, and they clung to trees and held on in the floodwaters so they would not be swept away. This was not an old man like me. This was a young man, a young woman in their 30s that feared for their lives. And when Brother Bobby Stevens told that story, he cried. Later on in another video on Facebook, he showed that house. Didn't show the man's face because that's that man's privacy and his story. But this dear pastor friend of mine, this dear brother in Christ, cried when he talked about the devastation that family experienced. They didn't want to leave. From what I've heard, I think they were afraid. They were afraid that, like other places, their home would be ransacked and vandalized if they left. But Brother Bobby and others convinced them to leave, and they'd set them up in a motel. Somebody would see to it that they had food and had water, a place to bathe. There's beauty shops down there that opened up just to wash women's hair, and men's hair too, I guess, if they wanted it. And there's companies that went down there with showers that people could take in a big semi-truck trailer. Tide and other companies went down and had washing and drying machines where folks could wash clothes. Pizza company went down there. They make frozen pizzas that you see a lot of times in the little convenience stores and stuff. They went down there with a semi, and they took hundreds and hundreds of frozen pizzas and baked them and gave them away for free. That's an amazing thing. People from all over the country, regardless of their personal beliefs, regardless of where they're from, are there to help. And it's going to continue for a long time. People providing free housing. Oneida, where I went, you know what they're saying? They're saying, hey, if you have students that can't go to school, we're a settlement school. We're a place where we have dormitories. If your boys and girls need to come to school, bring them to Oneida. We'll take care of them. And that's what us mountain folks do. That's what they're doing right now. If the mountains are part of you, if that old yellow clay of Clay County, it wasn't named Clay County, by the way, because of the yellow clay, but if we have any history, If our kin, our grandparents, our mamas, our daddies are buried down yonder, our hearts call to us all the time. And the mountains whisper a siren song saying, come home, come home, come home. And I'm going to tell you what's happening right now. Folks that love the mountains, folks whose roots are deeply grown down into the very rocks of those mountains, are doing exactly that. They're going home because they have family, they have kin, they have homesteads that call to them to come, to help. And that's what we need to do. Because you see, that's what Burns was all about. So that's my little piece of history before dawn. I'm looking that way every now and then on that little blow-up light that I'm showing you. There is a mosquito on there. It thinks that there's something for it. I guess that light's attracted it. I sprayed myself because I knew the skeeters would be out, and they haven't hit me as of yet. But apparently that little old mosquito thinks that there's something there. I'm just watching her actually, because I don't want her over here in my coffee. I don't know that I'd drink it if I had a mosquito land in there, but I just am tickled to death that she ain't finding none of my blood in that thing. So this is the old mountain Doc Holland, with a little history before dawn about James Anderson Burns and the founding of the Oneida Baptist Institute, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, settlement school in eastern Kentucky. So God bless. God bless Clay County and eastern Kentucky. It's supposed to rain more. They might have flooding more this weekend. And that just, that scares me. That breaks my heart. So pray for them. Help when you can. And with that, my friends, my brothers, and my sisters, kith and kin, God bless. I'll be talking to you soon.